Welcome back to DC Bar Let's Prove It podcast. I'm your co-host, Sophia Wang.
And I'm your other co-host, Jeevan Ramesh. Today we're going to interview two leading experts in banking law. They will be sharing with us their career paths and providing some advice for students interested in pursuing a path in the legalities of financial regulation.
We'll also be discussing some latest developments in the world of banking, including recent bank supervision reforms and the evolving landscape of digital assets regulation. Joining us today are two truly distinguished guests, Professors Scott Alvarez and Laurie Schaffer.
Both professors bring incredible experience to the table. Professor Alvarez was previously the General Counsel to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and Professor Schaffer served as the Assistant Secretary Acting of the Treasury for Financial Institutions.
As the chief legal officers of the Fed and the Treasury, respectively, they have provided counsel on many of the most critical regulatory and legislative issues of our time. I actually had the privilege of taking their banking regulation class last semester, so I know firsthand how much insight they have to share.
It is a great honor to have you both. Welcome to the show.
Great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yep. Thank you.
So you both have had incredible careers in financial regulation, but we'd like to know a bit about your backgrounds and what originally motivated you to pursue a career in this field.
Of course, I'm happy to. I actually started out really in financial regulation, working at the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. I found in law school that the courses and the areas of most interest turned out to be those that involved regulatory work. And so I pursued a career in that. And while at the FCC, the banks and securities firms had started offering products that crossed over what had traditionally been considered separation between banking and securities products. And I was lucky enough to be in a position to be able to work on that at its infancy. So that it really was happenstance. I thought I was going to be a securities lawyer. Scott?
Yeah, so my entry into financial services is a little more haphazard. While I was in law school, I tried a few different jobs through the summers. I worked for a public interest law firm doing migrant farm worker work my first year. Then I worked for a while at the New York Reserve Bank, where I got a taste of policy making and government work. And then I clerked for a law firm in my third year of law school. And I realized through those three jobs that I really enjoyed policy making, and I liked the scope of the government work, because instead of looking at just one client and one client's problems and trying to solve those problems, I was looking at a broader industry and broader principle making, which was pretty exciting for me. But I knew nothing about banking law. There were no banking law courses when I was in law school. And so I got an opportunity to work at the Federal Reserve in Washington and decided to take it to see what it would be like, figuring that on the path in the government, that's a good thing. If I don't like it, I can always go to a law firm or to some other institution. And I would see how it went, figuring I'd spend there 2 or 3 years. And then 36 years later, I retired from the Federal Reserve. I kept that job for my entire career. It was pretty fun and exciting. So it was a little more haphazard than it wasn't a conscious choice to go into financial services, but it's one that really held my interest.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. It's great to hear that you both have devoted your career to this public service field. So I guess for those of our listeners who are curious about public service, what was day-to-day life like serving as the chief legal officer for a major federal agency?
I'd like to back up a little bit to say a bit about what it was like to be a staff attorney before becoming the chief legal officer. It was very exciting for me as a young attorney at the Federal Reserve for a couple of reasons. One is I knew from my experience working at a law firm that most of what young associates do is they work in the library or in their office, they're researching problems, they're doing document review, or they're reading contracts. They're doing some very important but pretty menial kind of work. And at the Federal Reserve, it was quite different. I walk into the Federal Reserve, I'm assigned to a senior attorney who knows what's going on, But I immediately get involved in merger cases that the Federal Reserve had to approve. And it was my responsibility to be able to identify the legal issues, write up the legal issues, explain them to the Board of Governors, and then present them to the board. And so within 6 or 7 months of joining the Fed, I was sitting at the end of the long conference table with Paul Volcker, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve, at the other end, puffing cigar smoke into the room, along with a bunch of other governors who were going to make a decision that day on a merger. And Volcker says, after a presentation on the case, well, Mr. Alvarez, what should we do in this case? So I was not just in the back room doing some research. I was at the table in the room where it happens. And that was so exciting for me, was really the kind of thing that grabs your attention and makes you feel like you're part of something really important. So it was getting a chance to work on real projects with contact with the decision makers right from the start. That was pretty exciting. Later on in life, when I became the general counsel at the Fed, there was a lot more of that, a lot more meetings with the governors, testifying on the Hill, meeting with folks on the Hill, and getting the opportunity to do two things. One is provide a legal analysis. As the chief lawyer, that is the main job. You provide a legal analysis to the decision makers, what their range of options are for acting in a particular legal area. And then if the governors believe that you're giving them honest advice about the law, then they may ask you for your policy point of view. And that is also very exciting. But you sort of have to separate out. One of the things I learned as general counsel, you have to separate out your legal views from your policy views and not let your personal policy views influence your view of the law. You may have a chance to input your policy views into the decision, but that's really at the pleasure of the real decision makers. But I found that very exciting. And banking law changed a lot in the 36 years I was there. So it was always something new happening, always some new development. And they're all intellectually challenging. So that kept me interested and involved.
I had a similar experience. As a very junior lawyer, when I was at the SEC, as I mentioned earlier, it was at the time when banks and the walls between banks and securities firms were breaking down. And I had the opportunity to really become the expert in banking at the SEC. As I said, I thought I was going to be a securities lawyer, but I became a banking lawyer there. But it was the opportunity, because things were changing so quickly, for me as a relatively junior lawyer, to work with the chair of the SEC at the time, when a lot of other people just didn't have that opportunity. Usually it was the more senior people who worked with the chair, but because nobody else knew anything about banking, the SEC at the time, it fell to me to try to explain these various issues, ironically, including what the Fed was going to do with various applications, which I was learning by talking to people and reading and things like that. I also had the opportunity to serve as the acting general counsel at the Treasury Department at the beginning, I guess, in 2021. And that was a totally different experience. It was a lot like what Scott said, in that you had various issues and trying to run a department. But it was also interesting because it was the beginning of an administration. And a lot of the people at Treasury change over when a new president takes office. And the range of issues, it was everything from tax to anti-money laundering. Banking actually became a lesser focus for me because it involved trying to really stand up a new team and address a variety of issues in Treasury's portfolio. So that's really fun. It challenges you in a way that you don't expect, whether or not you can rise to the occasion. So careers in government are wonderful. You can get a lot of experience, a lot of responsibility very early. And you also get a lot of de novo issues and a range of de novo issues. You may see one or two in a law firm, but in the government, things hit you every day. That's something new that people haven't thought about.
If I could add one more thing, one of the things that also was important to me was work-life balance. When I first started at the Fed, I was a single parent of a 5-year-old son. And that was a wonderful experience, which I would never trade away for anything. But the government gave me the opportunity to work at a challenging and interesting job, but not be sort of under the gun to devote all my time to that. I was able to still be a good, a single parent. And as time went on and I became more senior, I had to devote more time to work. It got much more demanding. But by then, my son had moved on to college. And so everything worked out perfectly for me. But the work life balance, I think, is an important thing. It was important to me. Not always important to others, but I think that's something to keep in mind. And the banking agencies, the SEC, the financial services agencies, pay better than the regular government. So they actually make it possible to have a family and to work at a good job and to provide well for your family. It's not the same as a law firm by any stretch, but it's good enough to live comfortably. So another aspect.
Based on your long and important experiences, what do you think some of the core skills that were most important for you and might be most important to students who are considering going into banking and financial services on the legal side? What do you think some of the core skills that would be helpful might be?
Sure. I actually think the most important skill for a lawyer is curiosity. And I don't know if people are going to agree or disagree with that, but my experience in working with lawyers is that if somebody doesn't want to know or understand what the issue is and why it's the way it is and what has changed and what brought it about, I feel my experience is that you just get a surface analysis. And I think to me, to be a great lawyer, you have to understand what is the issue behind the just basic legal analysis. I have found that people aren't curious about what they're doing, who are just trying to put out an answer. Usually, as a senior lawyer in an agency, I found that they usually didn't provide the most effective analysis and effective options if they really weren't interested in digging into the issue and understanding it. I think good writing is important. It's important to be able to communicate clearly. I guess I'd say curiosity and good writing. The curiosity will help you refine the issue, will help you really understand what's going on and not just accept an easy response. And because a lot of times in government, particularly when you're advising policymakers, everybody sort of knows what the easy answer is. A lot of times people want to know what are the options and what else can we do and how to approach it. And if you're not curious and you don't have sort of a passion to understand it, it's hard to get to that.
I agree with Laurie entirely on that. Another aspect of the curiosity, I think, is to be a good lawyer, you have to continuously learn. There's new issues, there's new areas that are coming up all the time. And they may not be exactly the area that an assignment is in, but the more you know about a broader range of things, the better lawyer you can be. For example, with me, I had a strong interest in doing the kind of work that Laurie was doing, the convergence of banking and securities law. That was a really big issue early in our careers. It's now all settled, but back then it was brand new and revolutionary. And that was the area I wanted to go into. And I had a taste of it, but when the major assignment came along for that, it was given to another attorney in the office, and I was given an assignment in consumer law. I had no interest in consumer law at all. And I was afraid my career was going to go in a different direction. But, it was an assignment that I had to do. It turned out that it gave me an opportunity to meet new people, to learn about a different kind of law. Consumer law is so different than regulatory banking law. The kinds of issues you're dealing with, the statutory phrasing, the regulations, how they're written, their purpose, everything is different about it. And I learned how to think differently by doing that assignment. And it really broadened my legal skills. And I eventually got back into the core financial areas, But one of the reasons I was brought back in was because I was able to learn new things and I had a broader approach to the law. So learning, even if it seems to be in an area you're not interested in, helps to become a better lawyer. I think the other thing, and it's sort of, Laurie has touched on it as well, is you have to listen carefully to everybody, to your client, but also to the others that are advising the client. So the Federal Reserve, lawyers are like an island in a sea of economists. There's 4 or 5 times more economists than there are lawyers. The economists have a very different way of thinking about life. And again, learning to think a little bit like an economist helped me be a better lawyer, because then I could understand how they were weighing things, how they were approaching problems. And that opened my eyes to new ways to think about the law. So I think learning how to write and make presentations, those are definite core basic skills that are important for becoming a good lawyer. But also continuously learning, being curious, listening to others, those are all important skills.
Both of you mentioned about curiosity and novel banking law issues, and that's actually a great segue to my next question about the latest developments in banking law. So 2025 has been like a dynamic year for like banking law in many ways, and we're seeing a shift toward supervision focused on material, financial risks, alongside a major push for fintech and digital assets as alternatives to traditional banking. So, how should we think about this shifting agency priorities and supervisory philosophies? And how can entry level junior attorneys navigate the uncertainties and the opportunities in such a rapidly changing landscape?
So let me start with the second part of that question, because I think now is actually a great opportunity, a lot of great opportunities for young lawyers, because the landscape is changing and evolving. And so it's going to provide more jobs and more interesting work for young attorneys. And everybody's learning at the same time. So young attorneys have no disadvantage in coming into the financial services world right now. That's not like it has been in previous times where you had to already be an expert to become part of the fraternity. But now I think, stable coins and digital coins and what's going on there, how folks are approaching supervision, these are all novel things that we'll all learn together. There has always been a sort of pendulum swinging in the financial services regulatory world. We go from situations where administrations are very regulatory. They are concerned about the risks to financial services and the financial system. And then we move to, in the next administration, to a kind of approach that is more deregulatory, because the costs of regulation can be very high, and that has its consequences as well. So it's not unusual to see this shift back and forth. The job of a young attorney, or a senior attorney for that matter, is not to try to moderate the shifts or not to try to change the shifts. A lawyer is there to provide insight into what the options are under the law. And the law is there, and it may support multiple policy approaches. And it's important for the lawyer to understand and present those options to the decision makers. And then they can decide which side of the spectrum they want to be on. And as I said, sometimes they ask the lawyer for their personal point of view, but that's much less important to the job. What's most important to the job is laying out the options that are available to the decision maker to make their decision.
I agree with everything Scott said, but I would add one thing for a new lawyer now coming into this field. There's some fundamental changes taking place in the financial service industry, in some ways very similar to what happened when banking and securities began to converge. I mean, you're seeing, for example, the Fed approving on a limited basis the Kraken application. You're seeing the payment system is evolving, what bank charters are evolving. I mean, the fundamentals of how banks are regulated and how payments are regulated hasn't changed. And so, somebody should start really learning the basics, but how it's being applied is changing. So it's actually a very exciting time, I think, for a new lawyer to get into this area, because there's, let's face it, the power of computers and processing has really it's really changing the industry.
Thank you so much for that. And to wrap us up, why do you think students should consider a career in financial regulation law? And what do you see might be the next big, exciting development in the field?
Sure. I think what you're seeing with the impact of, and I'm not an expert in any of this, but I think what I just mentioned, you're seeing is the evolution of financial services with new entrants, with the payment system, tokenization. It's hard to know where we're going to be 5 to 10 years from now, but that's sort of exactly what happened when, as I mentioned, the banks and securities came together. It was unclear where it was going to go. It happened in steps, which is what is happening now. And I think it's an exciting time. Things are going to change a lot. And it would be great for a new attorney, as I mentioned, to learn the basics and sort of get on the ground floor, because how financial services are delivered and what is available is 10 years from now, it's going to be very different than what we have today.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Laurie. I think that it is a pretty exciting time to be coming into the field. There's a lot of opportunity on both the bank side and the regulatory side, and then the non-bank side, where financial services companies are providing services that banks traditionally provided. So there's a lot of opportunity, and the law is changing, and it's exciting because of the change and the intellectual challenges. And I think when you think what's the next big thing, there's going to be some problems and some mistakes made along this while things are changing. There always are problems as we test and figure out where the real risks are and how much risk is too much risk. And one of the things I think we're seeing now is that it's dissatisfaction with some of the burdens we've imposed on the banking industry that's caused these non-bank entities to spring into existence and want to operate. They want to operate outside of the restrictions that apply to banks. And banks are making that pretty clear. They want out of some of the restrictions. So the question is going to be, as we go forward with these new changes and with further developments, how much risk are we introducing into the financial system? And is it too much risk? That is scary, but it is also an opportunity, because as folks find out what kinds of risks there are and how best to address them, there'll be changes in the law. So I think it's a good time to be a lawyer, particularly in financial services, broadly speaking.
So before we go, if you had to leave our listeners with one piece of advice or just one thought to ponder, what would it be?
I guess I go back to whatever field people go into it with, as I said, curiosity and a passion, because I think that makes you a better lawyer. As I said, there's usually an obvious answer to a question, but then there's usually other ways to approach it. And if you're not curious and don't have a passion for it, you won't find those.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess I would say this is an exciting time to think about being a financial services lawyer. And it's an exciting time to think about being in government service. I know that sounds contrary to what's going on out there now and the kind of messages that the administration is sending. That said, this is a time when things will change. There are strong intellectual issues going on, and it's fun to be on the inside in the room where it happens. There's nothing more exciting than being part of the development of the law. So I would ponder very seriously, even at this point, trying to get into the government.
That certainly left us with a lot to think about. Thank you so much, Professors Alvarez and Schaffer, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for having us.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. That's it for today's episode. We'll see you next time.
The DC Bar law student community strives to engage and support law students before you graduate and expose you to the tangible benefits of joining the DC Bar and DC Bar communities. Curated programming allows law students to participate in leadership trainings, substantive content programming, networking with practicing attorneys in fields of interest, writing opportunities, and other activities designed to expand your legal education beyond the classroom. Make an investment in your legal career by joining the law student community. To learn more, visit us at www.dcbar.org or email communities@dcbar.org.